Well, it's a great pleasure for me to deliver this lecture that honours John Relly Beard. I've written 2 or 3 of the short biographies of him. He was perhaps one of the most significant, inspired figures and one of the most level-headed figures in the 19th century. He wasn't narrow-minded socially in respect of ministers, very different from his great friend James Martineau, and they shared a room, I think, when they were at Manchester College. He was an enthusiast for education for everyone, and he was one of the first writers of what you would call teach yourself books on everything that you'd like to mention. And he did it not only just in this country but elsewhere, and he became so well known that people used to write to him, John Beard, Manchester, England, and it would invariably be delivered. Such a famous figure as he was. Not many people nowadays could claim such notoriety. Well, it was the Ministerial Fellowship who gave me the title 200 Years Being Legal. They asked if I was content with it, and I said yes, because its brevity attracted me, and you could make much of things that are put briefly. It's 200 years from what is known as what we call the Trinity Act was passed, without dissent by both Houses of Parliament. Its correct title is an act to relieve persons who impugn, there's a nice word, impugn the doctrine of the Holy Trinity from certain penalties. And so here it is. You can't say you don't know what it is. This is taken from the Acts of Parliament published in about 1812. We all know it's the Dr. Williams's copy because there is an ink blot over Scotland. I don't enter into contemporary discussions, but you can take of that or what you like. In other words, the Act's application is personal, not organisational or collective. Its passing did not make our chapels legal for the first time. They were that already. What had become known as Unitarian chapels had their buildings registered for the worship of Protestant dissenters, unattached to any religious statement, and many buildings of many denominations were so registered. Those days, you had to register the building. Who do you think you registered it with? You registered it with the Church of England. What a thought. It wasn't until the 1850s that the state took over the registration of chapels. And of course, the bishops were not necessarily very keen at all of this, but they had to do it. It was the people who met and worshipped in the chapels that were relieved by the Act, if they called themselves Unitarian and held beliefs associated with the name. So it was the people who were relieved by the Act, not the chapels. All this had ramifications later on. The Unitarian denomination as a gathered group did not exist then. The first Unitarian body of individuals had been set up in 1791, and a few associations existed aimed at spreading the name and beliefs associated with it through the distribution of books. That's how we started collectively, the distribution of books. The main association was the Unitarian Fund, not an association, a fund, so it can't be got at, in 1806. There were no lists of chapels, there were no lists of ministers. The existence of the Act had no immediate practical effect. No action was taken against people holding Unitarian, nothing was dropped. Indeed, there had only been 2 actions under the Toleration Act of 1689 against people holding Unitarian views. One against Thomas Elwell in 1724, that failed. But an earlier case taken in Dublin against Thomas Emlyn, probably the first preacher to describe himself as a Unitarian, resulted in his imprisonment for a year in 1703. Attempts in Parliament in the late 18th century to in effect make Unitarianism legal all failed. The reason really being that everybody was thinking that you mustn't upset the Church of England as it might bring the whole constitution round while those naughty French people were having revolutions across the water. And that affected things. The 1813 bill passed because of the commitment of William Smith, known as the Unitarian MP. He was a most influential figure representing Norwich, who had worked behind the scenes from at least 1810 to get this measure through. Wasn't anything sudden. You can read in several places about the tacks and turns he took to ensure the bill passed. These can be summed up as getting the core cleared in advance with the powerful figures in the Church of England and in government. He did that through his influence, including the Archbishop of Canterbury. It was, however, a rocky ride. It only just about happened. The government agreed with the bill, but would not put it through themselves for fear of those persons that we might call evangelicals today. Smith's bill had to be withdrawn more than once. The first time, now what about this? Because not enough bishops were present in the Lords for a bill that had religious implications to pass. What about that? So no enactment to create religious freedom was then possible without the bishops of the Church of England in effect agreeing. I sometimes wonder, is that the present situation today? Oh, I'm not going to get into that one. That will keep us here all the afternoon. And secondly, because a relief measure for Roman Catholics had to be dealt with first. Partial relief, not a full relief. William Smith finally got agreement that the bill could be presented in 1813. But it was even further delayed until the last possible moment in the parliamentary session. It was on the last day. There was a general reluctance to put it through, but nobody was going to object to it, possibly because there were too many influential Unitarians about. We must wonder at William Smith's patience, for without his dogged determination and expertise, it would not have happened when it did. He must be classed among those Unitarian saints, if such a figure could possibly exist, but he'd be one of them. A high-minded man, he worked consistently for the abolition of slavery with his friend William Wilberforce, who of course was of an entirely different theological belief, being an ardent evangelical. In fact, there are some letters between Wilberforce and Smith that says, I see you still go to Unitarian meetings. I am very disappointed. And so in the end they agreed not to talk about their religious beliefs. The 1830 Act did give a real sense of relief in that saying you were Unitarian was now legal. You could do it. Thanks were given to the measure at meetings and to government ministers, but little more than this, except a generalised feeling of satisfaction. Robert Asplund, the main pushy figure of the period, and push he did, he was one of the main founders of some of the Unitarian bodies in the next 40 years. He wrote in the Monthly Repository, then the main journal, that Unitarians for the first time were freemen in their own land. Thomas Belsham, one of the great figures of Unitarian thought, was even more excited. In a sermon at Essex Street Chapel, just after its enactment, he said, "The repeal of those barbarous statutes which have so disgraced the British Code has now received the royal and, I trust, irrevocable fiat. I can scarcely persuade myself that it is real." When was the last time a Unitarian said that? I can scarcely persuade myself that it's real. The whole has the appearance of a wonderful and delightful vision. We are like them that dream. Not a lovely phrase. We are like them that dream. For this. That's a thought, isn't it? The only example I can find of a congregation celebrating the event is at the small Unitarian chapel at Paisley in Scotland on the second Sunday of September 1813, again reported in the Monthly Repository. They read the Act at the start of their special service to mark the event. Several people spoke, calling it a proper ground for rejoicing and thankfulness, affording the prospect of the gradual removal of long-established errors by the diffusion of knowledge and charity. They loved those long phrases, didn't they? The service concluded with prayer and praise, having continued for that very short time of 2.5 hours. They did it properly in those days. No half measures in celebration, long and detailed. But there was optimism and idealism from the future in plenty. Some historians have pointed out that the 1813 Act was good as far as it went. It protected the Unitarians, our main concern today, who were, of course, very respectable, very well behaved, and many of them were quite powerful. But what about the deists, or those who were critical of the broadly Christian God that all dissenters accepted? What about them? To relieve from the provisions of the 1689 Act those who doubted a God at all was rejected by virtually everybody. This stand, however, meant that the retention of those parts of the 1689 Act could still be directed against what could be called blasphemy. That is, I define it, remarks or actions considered to be contemptuous of God or the divine. This omission was to create problems later on and remained with us in England at least until into the 21st century. But Unitarians have always been exempt from attack. Now, you'd not really thought about that before. No actions have ever been taken for us against blasphemy or anything else. Because of this, we are specifically relieved, and in fact, the presence of this allows us to say, as Unitarians, almost anything in religious terms. You've not thought of that before, have you? And no actions were ever taken about Unitarians for charges of blasphemy, not anything like that at all. Privileged persons you are. However, over the next few years, there were gradual changes in several areas, and the word Unitarian was being used to describe meetings and even organisations. We were getting assertive, we were getting the elbows out. We got this thing here. For example, the Southern Unitarian Association, I said, started as a book fund, turned itself into a Unitarian fund aimed at supporting the message in the area. The signal event, of course, came in 1825 with the founding of the British and Foreign Unitarian Association, the first countrywide body within Unitarianism. I am today its chairman, but it doesn't do the things it did in those days. But without the 1813 Act, all this organisation would have not been possible, because somebody would have taken an action, and if it wasn't one of the dissident Unitarians, it would have been an evangelical. In other words, being legal created the denomination that we know today. Without legality, this step could never have been taken. The 1813 Act created the desire amongst some people at least to come together in a representative body. On the British and Foreign, the BNFUA, as we always call it, you know what I say if I say it, the BNFUA enshrined the protection extension of civil rights of Unitarians and others in its activities. It had a civil rights department specifically reporting to it annually well into the 20th century. They were conscious of civil rights to a degree that I suggest that we in the 21st century are not. We have tended to forget what being illegal means. If there had been no 1813 Act, relief for Unitarians would have come at some stage in the 19th century. Couldn't have done anything else with all the developments that were taking place. But it would have been a later date, and between the time of 1813 and when the Act was passed, we would have been in a form of limbo. We would not have expanded when we did. The General Assembly of Unitarian and Free Christian Churches, lovely phrase, has in its current constitution an object which affirms the worth and dignity of all people, which is best served where the mind and conscience are free. Doesn't that sound fine? But it's a rather tame statement, isn't it? Isn't it rather tame? Where is the GA Civil Rights and Freedoms Department, which our forerunners in the BNFUA maintain consistently? Except as expressed by individuals, I put it to you that Unitarians have lost their fire in the pursuit of civil and religious liberty the world over, though the situation has changed and improved of late. We seemingly have become more involved in the subject, perhaps seeing its attack the world over. In the revision of the GA objects of the 1980s, these liberties were stated, but the Charity Commission said advancement of civil and religious liberty was political, and therefore unacceptable. Some of the people here will remember all of that, don't they? Oh, yes, I can see a lot of people nodding. To keep charitable status, the GA rather meekly gave in and removed the reference to civil and religious liberty. Why did we give in so easily? In respect of one of our central affirmations that had come out of that. Should we not return to the fight now and very possibly get a different answer from the Charity Commission in changed times? Being legal has tended to produce caution and possibly timidity, to say the least, and I leave it to you to think about what more than least is. In other words, we are dead scared of doing anything that's going to upset any risk of our charity status. As commentators have pointed out, the 1813 Act was but the final step in clearing the ring for Unitarian controversy, in particular with the assertive evangelicals. This set the scene for arguing with the evangelicals. Both sides were fired up. Unitarians were not, they stirred things up as well, so it wasn't just the orthodox. Both sides were fired up to be aggressive, and their clash saw the relative end of old dissent. In other words, people used to get on very well. The formal congregations, the Baptists, they preached at each other's. That started to disappear around 1800. But this put the stopper on it completely. They said, right, they're all free, don't like it. A platform for the fight to knock Unitarians out of the ring was looked for, and the Lady Hewley Charity was a convenient vehicle to use this to achieve this end in 1819, only 6 years afterwards. The same year, incidentally, that Unitarians set up a civil rights association, because apart from what the British and founded, there was a civil rights association to build on what was achieved by this. This is not the place to give a detailed description of what happened over the next 25 years, and those who followed it on the same point of law. Suffice it to say that the Hewley Charity, which had Unitarian trustees and gave grants to Unitarian churches, was set up by Lady Hewley at the early 18th century, and the test she gave for its application was a piece of absolutely abstruse but very orthodox theological writing that she admired. The non-Unitarian trustees took action before the courts, and the courts go on and say, well, it was illegal then, so it shouldn't be given to Unitarian bodies. Courts didn't like this, but they had to do that. And then there was an example and a great big argument over a chapel in Wolverhampton, which all got mixed up with it. So in the 1840s, there was seemingly endless, it all led up to the 1830s, to endless legal arguments before the courts. It was a time when Unitarianism couldn't expand because we were frightened we were going to lose a lot. The upshot was that the courts found that because Unitarianism was legal, those chapels and trusts formed before 1813, which advocated Unitarianism, could potentially have their trustees removed by court order. One of the leading figures says, right, I'm booking my seat in Cross Street Chapel, Manchester. And the other said, right, we're going to get hold of Dr. Williams's trust because the Unitarians are in there and we're going to get them out. And all those letters showing all this. And of course, this actions crippled Unitarian organisation expansion, and fundraising was impossible because you didn't want to give funds to a body that was going to disappear to people who were very theologically orthodox. The issue came to a head in 1844, and to prevent this happening, Unitarians did a thing they've never done before and never done since. They formed a caucus. They took a house in the Strand, and all the leading Unitarians went there daily and went to see MPs and peers to persuade them that there must be something different. Because then, believe it or not, of the dissenters, the largest number of MPs were Unitarians, more than any of the other Baptist or Congregationalists. And so this is the Unitarian power. You don't see this. Government were conscious of this. Surprise, surprise. Governments are always counting votes, aren't they? Not. And so they decided to put a bill before Parliament to say 25 years usage in a chapel meant that's what it stayed. These events have often been told, and I'm not going to go into them there. It was a Unitarian triumph. We won, but it was exhausting. But if it wasn't for this 1813 Act, this anti-Unitarian move by Orthodox dissenters would not have arisen, of course. If we'd remained illegal, the dispute would have in some ways got worse. But when the issue was resolved in 1844, the biggest expansion in Unitarianism took place in the next 25 years. Everywhere. All our district associations, if you look at the dates, you go back and they're all formed basically in the 1850s. And it was John Relly Beard, who we're celebrating today, and here's the little leaflet produced in 1996 for the first lecture with a description of him, because I was there then. And he produced a book, Unitarianism Exhibited in Its Actual Condition, with lots of things. Now, if you want to, you can read this online. There's two copies of it put online. So you can look at this. It's a tribute to him because he produced the first proper list of Unitarian chapels in this country at the end. Very important. Being legal under these acts enabled Unitarianism to exist and to flourish. And those formed after the 1850s, chapels formed after the 1850s, become an essential part of our denomination. Now we might ask, what happened on the anniversaries of this passing of this great act? In 1863, well, the Inquirer of the 18th of July in its opening article gave the history of what happened and lamented that the reform had not gone further, in particularly highlighting that blasphemy had not been got rid of. It was the time when the toast to civil and religious liberty was most heard, and the denominational press has numerous examples given, often up to 1872 by one of its most well-known sons, Sir John Bowring, the family that founded the bank that went bust. He consistently pointed out that it was better than when he was a boy in Exeter, but it could be improved. Some say this was a terrible cheek on his part, because Sir John Bowring had been an MP and he had to be got rid of because of dubious financial goings-on. But as he then said, and this is very difficult, I know too much about the political powerful, shall I say it all if you take me to court? They said, where can we get rid of him? But we can't do anything nasty. Where would you want to get rid of him in the middle of the 18th century? He was made the governor of Hong Kong. Now, if this is not removing somebody totally from the scene, and while he was there, he created all forms of problems, excessively assertive. There's a letter still in existence to the King of Siam saying that if you don't open your markets to British goods, I've got a lot of troops here and gunboats to put it into effect. And there he was talking about civil and religious liberty. The 100th anniversary was used to see how a new exciting world was in creation. And the Christian Life, when they produced this amazing production, I've got to go, May the 10th, 1913, it's 110 pages on the history of Unitarianism. It's a superb thing. Those who've got a copy, it's a great source. There aren't many copies about, but those who've got them don't hand them over very quickly. But you see, this is the assertive nature of this. They put pictures. You see, would we ever do this? You see all the pictures of these rather established gentlemen here. They are some of our contributors, and the following page is another one there that says, some of these men have come over from Orthodoxy. Can you imagine us doing that at a later time this day? But this was a real, but it's a history of worldwide Unitarianism, not just in this country, and it's a remarkable production. There you are, the ministers who come over from Orthodoxy. Because in the period before the First World War, there was lots of, the theological term was Maelstrom, the new theology movement of Campbell was creating lots of dissent, and people were coming into Unitarianism, became ministers for about 2 years, and then left for something else. So there was a lot of them. There they were wallowing in it. What about when you get to 1963, the 100th and 50th anniversary? Well, I and one or two people, I see John and others, were here then, 1963, and remember that. What happened then? The answer I can see was nothing at all. British Unitarianism were one of their throes of one of their usual joys, the partial reorganisation of the General Assembly. Those who have only seen the 21st century will just see nothing. It went on in, tinkering about this, tinkering about that. I sat on two, and there's one or two here that I think will sat on one or two of these partial, and they produced a lovely sonorous report, and then nothing happened, and it all stayed exactly the same. Because there is an argument to say that we might be radical in our views, but when it comes to organisation, we are extremely rock solid. Can't alter very much at all. Now, in 1963, our occupation was to be internal. Great arguments, and there's the humanist theist debate. Do you remember all of that going on endlessly as it had gone since the 1930s? Dispiriting stuff. But the cry to civil and religious liberty the world over was not often heard, and Unitarians have become very settled in their legality. At 200 years of legality, we've seen we are more conscious of the anniversary. Last year, we produced special issues of the Inquirer and a special service. The GA has created a worship pack for the bicentenary, and there we put in the Article 18 of the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So true. A modern view of liberty in our world. An appropriate comment came from our chief officer here on the 200th anniversary, which appeared in the most unlikely of places. He got into the Church Times. 2nd of August 2013, give him 10 out of 10 for that. Unitarians celebrate emergence from the shadows, he said. He pointed out that Unitarians in the UK had moved on from defining themselves as against the Trinity, now focusing on the oneness of God and the oneness of humankind. Then there was a feature article in The Independent by Boyd Tonkin on the 13th of December 2013. And this stated, one bicentenary has seemed to have slipped under the media radar this year. Despite its soporific title, The Doctrine of the Trinity Act 1813, well, that wasn't its title, but never mind, did something truly revolutionary. Through an amendment to the Blasphemy Act, it gave legal protection to Unitarian worship after 3 centuries, during which religious radicals in England who deny the divinity of Jesus Christ had faced vilification, ostracisms, persecution, the prison cell. 200 years after the Forgotten Act, nobody could say a bad word about Unitarians. There's better to come. That enlightened, here is the right one, what about this? Now you can quote this. That enlightened congregation of gentle seekers, whose notable adherents stretch from the novelist Elizabeth Gaskell to web pioneer Tim Berners-Lee. Now, I hope you're going to remember that. That enlightened congregation of gentle seekers. Along with Quakers and liberal Jews, Stephen Fry, the supreme pontiff nowadays of a certain brand. Well, he is, isn't he? Supreme pontiff, no doubt about that. Well, he said, very easy to get along with, and since they are not concerned with conversion, with proving themselves better or righter than anyone else, nor with splitting up into factions. When I wrote a thing years and years ago about that split us off from the not strangers but pilgrims thing, I described the various views expressed in Unitarianism. And one of the leading Baptists came up to me and says, is there a separate organisation for each of these bodies? Is it also? I said, no, it doesn't work that way. Can't see why it doesn't. And then the Archbishop of York had the cheek to say to Christine Hayhurst, when we were at a thing, I've read this thing. How do you all stay together? Thank goodness she had the presence of mind and says, well, the same could be said about the Church of England. But yet, he finishes up, Unitarianism was once, in Christian terms, the foulest heresy of all. We've come a long way in 200 years to be called that enlightened congregation of gentle seekers, with a bonus of praise by Stephen Fry, one of our gurus. In some ways, we certainly seem to have arrived. That last sentence of the Church Times article from Derek Macaulay is a key one, which I'll repeat. Our commitment to religious freedom stems directly from our own experience. That surely is a major area of significance of the 1813 Act today, or should be. Hopefully the last 2 centuries have taught us to value religious freedom. Maybe we're not always as active in its proclamation as we should be. Sometimes being legal has made us over-concerned with legality, and we seem that we do not wish to step out of line. The Unitarian denomination, I call it that and not a sect, though on occasion it's looked like one, hasn't it? Like a sect, does not take radical action, though its principles indicate that it should. The concern for being legal sometimes has prompted Unitarians to take no action at all, particularly at certain periods in the 20th century. Some have said that around the mid-20th century, that was due to having too many lawyers and civil servants in their midst. As I was one of those, I suppose I shouldn't agree, but I'm not going to pursue that avenue. However, that phase of timidity seems now to have passed, and we have recently been more ready to speak out and be counted. That surely is the message for today and for the future reach of the 1813 Act. Can I summarise what being legal has meant over the last 200 years? As I've already said, Unitarianism would have eventually been legalised at some stage in the early 19th century if it had not happened in 1813. The drift of the age would have required it. It could have happened in the 1790s, but for the impact of French Revolution and Unitarians seeing too much in its support. The Church of England, unreformed and bloated with anomalies as it was, and it maybe still is, was judged as requiring defence, and legalising Unitarianism would say that undermining that. The support given to the principles of the Revolution by many Unitarians was seen as dangerous to the body politic. Let's not forget that. It said that when Priestley preached on few occasions, there were almost as many figures from the Secret Service there as there were congregation. The rising sense of denominationism generally, including Unitarian assertiveness, was created out of this act, and it was matched by the spread of evangelical feeling. This made the challenge commence in 1819 and finishing in 1844 with Unitarian triumph and almost certain development, aided by the large number of Unitarian MPs. The completion of legalisation took place with the Dissenters' Chapels Act. It was only then that Unitarian congregations were safe in free law and could expand without risk. Their message matched the spirit of the time. Most supported the message of Darwin, for example, and they entered the late 19th century, finishing the 1890s, a golden age in numbers and in feeling and what we did, a golden age. The creation of the General Assembly in the 20th century would not have been possible without the existence of the 1813 and the 1844 Act. No General Assembly. What we are today can be traced back to the influence of these two pieces of legislation. Our attitudes and polity have to a large degree arisen out of the 19th century experience of legality. 200 years of being legal is a real cause for celebration. It has, for good or ill, influenced our attitude and maybe even our theology. Think on that one. I say to the students here, discuss. Being legal has made us what we are. We can ask, what is the challenge of being legal today? Perhaps a clue is developed by Boyd Tompkin in the Independent article from which I've quoted. The spark for this article was the decision by the Supreme Court in this country to allow a Church of Scientology to count as a location for religious worship, and so a fit place for the solemnation of a faith-based ceremony of marriage. He argued that the court's logic in allowing the Scientology marriage was in line with the decisions going back hundreds of years, including this act. Quote, during Britain's long religious twilight, traditional believers have routinely complained about the rise of what they see as wacky sects and fringe faith. Unitarians or others have been proscribed by these complainants until the courts intervened, which is still happening today, as demonstrated, whether we like it or not, by the Scientology decision. Boyd Tompkin closes his article with a statement: the blessing of these supposed superstitions is the triumph of freedom. We should ask if there is still a limit to the triumph of religious freedom in the 20th century in this country. We celebrate 200 years of being classed as insiders. Are there others outside whose rights we must fight for in our quest for civil and religious freedom? Who next are we to support in the name of freedom, to take their place under the legal religious umbrella. And perhaps on a wider front, how is civil and religious liberty to be extended the world over? As we know, it hardly exists in so many, many places. We claim to press for these freedoms. Our 19th century Unitarian ancestors had them as major concerns worldwide, and they felt the lack of them. In our comfortable position today, are we as concerned as they were? I put it to you, that is our challenge.